Hi, I'm Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power, and this is my daily thought. I want to talk about the many civil wars that are being waged in our country right now. People perceive it to be on two different ends of the spectrum. Black people on one end, blue on the other end. What Dr. Robert Vargas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame, and I actually assert in our Public Radio International op-ed, is that instead we have a much more dynamic problem. Besides this binary that doesn't necessarily even exist in the way that it does, in the way that people are couching it and framing it as police officers versus black people. With the shootings in San Bernardino, Newtown, Charleston, Orlando, Chicago, now St. Paul, Baton Rouge, and Dallas, we're seeing a barrage of many civil wars being waged and fought on American streets. Civil war is defined as a war between citizens of the same country. The Civil War of the 1800s was a large-scale economic conflict between the North and the South about black slaves as property. But what we've seen recently in South Carolina, Orlando, Dallas, and Baton Rouge are acts of civil war rooted in hatred on the basis of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, and in responses to that particular hatred and oppression. And that becomes very, very key to note. Like treaties to help end wars, we need legislation to put an end to our nation's gun violence. We need a national standard defining excessive use of force. We need a Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. We need a Stop Police Brutality Act of 2016. But before we can pass any legislation, and the NAACP has noted these particular, a push for these particular policies, we need to better understand how racism works, find commonalities among police and black communities, and neutralize the fearmongers exploiting our citizens' pain. See, our main narrative about racism assumes that racism is a sickness and only rooted in people's minds, right? And so what that means is that for some sort of reason, then on the other end of the spectrum, black people who are now engaging in massive acts of violence, as we saw in Dallas and San Bernardino, that there are a few narratives that need to be debunked. First is the narrative that black people who care about justice but choose to act that out in certain forms of vengeance and revenge can do that without necessarily being connected to a group or an organization or a cause. And in this case, Black Lives Matter, where both the Dallas and the Baton Rouge shooters both said, I'm not affiliated with any group. No matter what they say, people are going to still try to affiliate them with Black Lives Matter, even though they've said the contrary, right? And that's because the narrative we have assumes that black people are also homogenous, right? That we are all the same. And so this is the reason why I can get confused with one of my colleagues who's 6'4" and may weigh a whole lot more than me, and we may have different skin complexions, because when it comes to black people, to some people, our social identities trump our personal identities, right? And we become less known for our individuality and more known as being part of a group. So again, black people are dynamic. We're heterogeneous. We're complex, just like any other group, right? So people can be for justice, vengeance, and even act those things out in violent forms of revenge. And that's highly problematic, right? But at the same time, it's important, particularly as sociologists, for us to understand these dynamics. And that's one of the things that we try to bring to bear. The third narrative I want to debunk is that for some reason, black people assume black people can't have mental health problems, right? I mean, clearly the Baton Rouge and the Dallas shooters clearly had some issues, right? And I think we cannot put aside the fact that both of them were in the military, that there are certain forms of connections, that they weren't affiliated with groups. We have to actually put that into context, right? And it's interesting if we compare them to, say, Dylan Roof, and not the act per se, but the response to the act. So for both the Baton Rouge and Dallas shooters, they were both killed. For Dylan Roof, not only did he get away at that moment, but then when he was apprehended, he was hungry on his way to being booked, and they took him to Burger King. So here is a young white man who just murdered 9 people in a church, right? 9 people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, at Mother Emanuel AME. Murdered 9 people after they prayed with him, read the Bible with him, and he even thought about not continuing with those acts. Instead, he murdered them anyway in cold blood. And what's interesting is that then they took him to Burger King. The police took him to Burger King. So I want you to think about this dynamic for black people. A white person who says he's killing black people because they're black comes into a church which is a safe space. Anybody who's been to a black church knows it's one of the most welcoming places you've ever been. People greet you. They give you all sorts of stuff. They say if you're a visitor, stand up. People come over. They shake your hand. They hug you. They have all kind of conversations with you. They want to learn about you. And so people who try to say that the black church is something different, you haven't really been to a black church to make those statements. That's how I instantly know how well you potentially know black people when you make statements like that, right? So what's interesting is that Dylann Roof, after he did those acts, he thought about not doing it. That's just how well they treated him. But then he murders them in cold blood.